Question 1. Operational review demonstrates that a penetration test identified several technical vulnerabilities, including an unpatched legacy system with known exploits and a web application susceptible to SQL injection. The client's primary concern is maintaining compliance with specific industry regulations. Which approach to reporting and prioritizing these findings best aligns with professional penetration testing practices and regulatory expectations in the U.S.? Option A. Prioritize findings based on their potential to impact sensitive data, disrupt critical business operations, or lead to regulatory noncompliance, clearly articulating the business risk associated with each technical vulnerability. Option B. Report only those vulnerabilities that directly map to specific clauses within the client's stated regulatory compliance requirements, ignoring others. Option C. Exaggerate the potential impact of minor technical findings to ensure the client understands the critical nature of the engagement. Option D. Focus solely on the technical severity scores, e.g., CVSS, of each vulnerability, as these provide an objective measure of risk. The correct answer is A. Prioritize findings based on their potential to impact sensitive data, disrupt critical business operations, or lead to regulatory noncompliance, clearly articulating the business risk associated with each technical vulnerability. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing where technical findings, while impactful, may not immediately translate into actionable business risk for the client. The professional challenge lies in bridging the gap between technical vulnerability identification and the client's understanding of its potential business consequences, ensuring that the findings are not dismissed due to a lack of perceived urgency or relevance. Careful judgment is required to prioritize findings based on their potential impact, not just their technical severity. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves correlating technical findings with potential business impacts and regulatory compliance requirements. This aligns with best professional practices in penetration testing, which emphasize providing actionable intelligence to clients. Specifically, within the U.S. regulatory framework relevant to penetration testing, e.g., NIST SB 800-115, which informs many compliance standards like PCI DSS and HIPAA. The goal is to identify vulnerabilities that could lead to data breaches, service disruptions, or noncompliance. By linking a technical finding like an unpatched server to the potential for unauthorized access to sensitive customer data, e.g., PII under HIPAA or cardholder data under PCI DSS, the tester demonstrates the business risk and regulatory implications, making the finding relevant and urgent for the client. This approach ensures that the client can make informed decisions about remediation based on business priorities and legal obligations. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely focus on the technical severity of findings, such as the CVSS score, without considering the business context or potential impact. This fails to meet the ethical obligation of providing valuable and actionable insights to the client. From a regulatory perspective, this approach could lead to a failure to identify and report vulnerabilities that, while technically moderate, could have significant business or compliance consequences, potentially violating the spirit of regulations like Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX, which requires adequate internal controls to prevent financial misstatement due to security incidents. Another incorrect approach is to overstate the impact of minor technical findings to create a sense of urgency. This is professionally unethical and erodes client trust. It also fails to adhere to the principle of accurate and honest reporting, which is implicitly expected under professional standards and can undermine the credibility of future findings. While not a direct violation of a specific U.S. law in this context, it breaches professional conduct expected by organizations like ISACA or ISC2, which govern ethical behavior in information security. A third incorrect approach is to ignore findings that do not directly relate to specific, explicitly stated compliance requirements, even if they represent a clear security risk. This is a failure to provide a comprehensive security assessment. For instance, a vulnerability that allows for privilege escalation, even if not directly tied to a specific data type protected by HIPAA, could be a stepping stone to accessing such data. A thorough penetration test, guided by frameworks like NIST, should identify such risks to provide a holistic view of the security posture, not just a compliance checklist. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach. This involves understanding the client's business objectives, the data they handle, and the regulatory landscape they operate within. When presenting findings, the focus should be on translating technical vulnerabilities into business risks and potential compliance failures. This requires clear communication, a deep understanding of the client's environment, and the ability to articulate the so what of each finding. The decision-making process should prioritize findings that pose the greatest threat to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of critical assets, and that could lead to significant financial, reputational, or legal repercussions. Question 2. Which approach would be most effective for a penetration tester to prioritize remediation efforts for a large organization with numerous identified vulnerabilities, considering both technical severity and potential business impact, in alignment with U.S. regulatory expectations for risk management? Option A. Prioritize remediation based on the technical severity rating, e.g., CVSS score of each vulnerability, addressing the most critical ones first regardless of their specific business context. Option B. Focus on remediating the vulnerabilities that are easiest and quickest to fix, aiming to demonstrate progress and reduce the overall number of findings rapidly. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment for each identified vulnerability, evaluating its likelihood of exploitation and potential business impact, and then prioritize remediation based on the resulting risk scores. Option D. Rely primarily on the client's internal IT team's perception of which vulnerabilities are most important to address, without conducting an independent risk assessment. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment for each identified vulnerability, evaluating its likelihood of exploitation and potential business impact, and then prioritize remediation based on the resulting risk scores. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the urgency of identified high-severity vulnerabilities with the finite resources available for remediation. The professional challenge lies in effectively communicating risk to stakeholders and prioritizing remediation efforts in a way that aligns with business objectives and regulatory compliance, without being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of findings. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core principles of risk management, as mandated by frameworks like NIST SB 800-30, which is foundational to U.S. cybersecurity regulations, and practices relevant to the CompTIA PenTest Plus exam. This approach involves a systematic evaluation of the likelihood and impact of each vulnerability, translating technical findings into business-relevant risks. Prioritizing based on this risk assessment ensures that the most critical threats to the organization's assets and operations are addressed first, thereby optimizing resource allocation and maximizing the return on security investments. This aligns with the ethical obligation of a penetration tester to provide actionable and impactful recommendations that genuinely improve the organization's security posture. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the technical severity of vulnerabilities, without considering business impact, fails to provide a holistic risk picture. This can lead to misallocation of resources, where technically severe but operationally minor vulnerabilities consume disproportionate attention, while less technically obvious but business-critical risks are overlooked. This can also lead to friction with business stakeholders who may not understand the prioritization if it doesn't directly correlate with their perceived business impact. Ethically, this approach falls short by not providing the most valuable guidance for risk reduction. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes vulnerabilities based on ease of remediation, without regard for risk, is equally problematic. While quick wins can be tempting, this strategy can lead to a false sense of security. It might address many low-impact issues, leaving high-impact vulnerabilities unaddressed. This directly contravenes the principle of effective risk management, which demands that resources be directed towards mitigating the most significant threats. From a regulatory perspective, failing to address high-impact risks could lead to non-compliance with data protection laws or industry-specific security standards, as it demonstrates a lack of due diligence in protecting sensitive information or critical systems. A third incorrect approach that relies on the client's subjective opinion without a structured risk assessment process can lead to biased prioritization. While client input is valuable, it should be informed by a professional risk assessment. Without this, decisions might be driven by personal preferences or political considerations rather than objective risk analysis, potentially leaving the organization exposed to significant threats. This undermines the integrity of the penetration testing process and the professional's role as an objective advisor. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment methodology. This includes identifying assets, threats, vulnerabilities, and then analyzing the likelihood and impact of each threat-vulnerability pair. This analysis should be translated into a risk score or rating that is clearly communicated to stakeholders. The penetration tester should then facilitate a discussion with the client to align these technical risk assessments with business priorities and operational realities, leading to a collaboratively agreed-upon remediation plan that prioritizes the highest risks. Question 3. The review process indicates that during an active reconnaissance phase, a penetration tester identified a web server hosting what appears to be sensitive employee data. The tester has confirmed that the data is accessible via a simple HTTP GET request without any authentication. Which of the following actions best aligns with ethical and legal requirements for penetration testing in the United States? Option A. Document the finding, including the method of access, and report it to the client for further instruction without accessing the data. Option B. Attempt to exploit a potential vulnerability on the web server to gain deeper access and confirm the extent of the data exposure. Option C. Immediately download a sample of the sensitive data to demonstrate the severity of the finding to the client. Option D. Perform a denial of service, DoS, attack on the web server to test its resilience against such threats. The correct answer is C. Immediately download a sample of the sensitive data to demonstrate the severity of the finding to the client. Explanation. The review process indicates a potential ethical dilemma during an active reconnaissance phase of a penetration test. The challenge lies in balancing the need to gather comprehensive information with the imperative to avoid unauthorized access or disruption, especially when sensitive systems are identified. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions remain within the agreed-upon scope and adhere to legal and ethical boundaries. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the established rules of engagement and legal frameworks. Specifically, in the context of U.S. regulations relevant to penetration testing, actions must be explicitly authorized. Techniques like port scanning and banner grabbing are generally permissible if they are part of the agreed-upon scope and do not involve exploiting vulnerabilities or accessing unauthorized data. This approach ensures that the penetration tester operates within legal boundaries, such as those implied by the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA, by not exceeding authorized access. It also upholds ethical standards by respecting the client's systems and data. An incorrect approach involving attempting to exploit a discovered vulnerability without explicit authorization would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action would likely violate the CFA by constituting unauthorized access. Ethically, it breaches the trust placed in the penetration tester by the client and could lead to unintended consequences, such as data corruption or system downtime, for which the tester could be held liable. Another incorrect approach, such as performing a denial of service, DoS, attack to test system resilience, even if not explicitly forbidden, is highly problematic. A resilience testing might be a valid objective. A DoS attack, even a limited one, can cause service disruption and is often illegal under laws like the CFA, as it can impede authorized access to systems. This action demonstrates a lack of judgment and disregard for potential impact. A further incorrect approach, such as accessing and exfiltrating sensitive data identified during reconnaissance, even if the data is readily accessible through the reconnaissance technique, is a clear violation of privacy laws and ethical conduct. This constitutes unauthorized access and data theft, leading to severe legal repercussions and professional disgrace. The professional reasoning process for similar situations involves a strict adherence to the rules of engagement ROE. Before initiating any active reconnaissance, a penetration tester must thoroughly understand and confirm the scope of the engagement, including permitted techniques and target systems. When unexpected findings arise, such as potentially sensitive systems or vulnerabilities, the tester must pause and consult with the client or designated point of contact to seek explicit authorization before proceeding with any actions that might exceed the initial scope or carry a higher risk of disruption or unauthorized access. This iterative communication and authorization process is crucial for maintaining legal compliance and ethical integrity. Question 4. The analysis reveals that a penetration tester is engaged to assess the security posture of a financial institution operating under U.S. federal regulations. The contract explicitly defines the scope of the assessment to include only the client's public-facing web applications and explicitly prohibits any testing of internal network infrastructure or customer databases. The tester is considering using a comprehensive vulnerability scanner that, by default, attempts to identify and fingerprint a wide range of services and protocols, some of which might be present on internal systems if not carefully configured. Which of the following approaches best adheres to the regulatory framework and contractual obligations for this engagement? Option A. Employ a less sophisticated, network-agnostic scanning tool that can only identify basic web vulnerabilities, to absolutely guarantee that no internal systems are inadvertently scanned, even if this means missing potential vulnerabilities on the public-facing applications. Option B. Utilize the comprehensive vulnerability scanner in its default configuration to gain the broadest possible understanding of the client's attack surface, assuming that any findings, even if outside the explicit scope, will be valuable for the client's overall security awareness. Option C. Configure the vulnerability scanner to target only the specified IP ranges of the public-facing web applications, ensuring all internal network scanning capabilities are disabled and that the scanner's output is filtered to exclude any unexpected findings outside the defined scope. Option D. Conduct a broad scan of all accessible IP addresses within the client's network range, and then manually filter the results to identify which findings pertain to the public-facing web applications, while disregarding any findings related to internal systems. The correct answer is C. Configure the vulnerability scanner to target only the specified IP ranges of the public-facing web applications, ensuring all internal network scanning capabilities are disabled, and that the scanner's output is filtered to exclude any unexpected findings outside the defined scope. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need for comprehensive vulnerability scanning with the legal and ethical constraints of operating within a defined scope and adhering to specific regulatory frameworks. The professional challenge lies in selecting vulnerability scanning tools and methodologies that are both effective in identifying potential weaknesses and compliant with the client's explicit instructions and applicable U.S. federal regulations, particularly those related to data privacy and unauthorized access. Misinterpreting or exceeding the authorized scope can lead to legal repercussions, breach of contract, and damage to the penetration tester's reputation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves selecting vulnerability scanning tools that are explicitly permitted by the client's contract and that operate strictly within the defined scope of the engagement. This means prioritizing tools that can be configured to avoid scanning unauthorized systems or data types, and ensuring that the scanning process itself does not inadvertently cause disruption or exceed the agreed-upon testing parameters. For engagements involving U.S. federal regulations, this approach aligns with principles of lawful access and data protection, such as those outlined by NIST guidelines and potentially HIPAA or FISMA if applicable to the client's data. The emphasis is on authorized, controlled, and documented testing activities. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves using advanced, aggressive scanning tools without explicit client authorization or without thoroughly understanding their potential impact. This could lead to the discovery of vulnerabilities on systems outside the agreed scope, or worse, cause service disruptions. Ethically and legally, this constitutes unauthorized access and potentially a violation of the client's network, which is a direct contravention of the Penetration Testing Agreement and could violate laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA, if interpreted broadly. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on automated scanning without manual validation, especially if the automated tools are known to produce a high rate of false positives or are not configured to respect the client's specific network segmentation or data handling policies. Automation is efficient. A failure to tailor the scanning process to the client's environment and regulatory context can lead to incomplete or misleading results, and potentially the inadvertent exposure of sensitive information if the tool is not properly configured. This can also be seen as a failure to exercise due diligence and professional care, potentially violating contractual obligations for thoroughness. A third incorrect approach is to use open-source tools that have not been vetted for their compliance with the client's security policies or for their potential to introduce unintended side effects. While open-source tools can be powerful, their use must be carefully managed. If such a tool were to inadvertently scan or attempt to exploit systems outside the scope, or if it were to log sensitive data in an insecure manner, it could create significant legal and ethical liabilities, potentially violating data privacy regulations and the terms of the engagement. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based decision-making process. This begins with a thorough review of the client contract, scope of work, and any specific regulatory requirements. Before selecting any tool, a risk assessment should be performed to evaluate its potential impact on the client's environment, its ability to stay within scope, and its compliance with legal and ethical standards. Documentation of tool selection, configuration, and testing methodology is crucial for accountability and auditability. When in doubt, seeking clarification from the client or choosing a less aggressive, more controlled tool is the prudent course of action. Question 5. Quality control measures reveal that during a penetration test conducted under U.S. regulatory frameworks, a tester discovers a critical vulnerability in a system component that was explicitly excluded from the agreed-upon scope of work. The tester has successfully demonstrated a proof of concept for exploiting this vulnerability. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the penetration tester? Option A. Ignore the out-of-scope vulnerability entirely, as it falls outside the defined testing parameters, and focus solely on the in-scope systems. Option B. Continue to fully exploit the out-of-scope vulnerability to gather as much information as possible about its impact, and then include detailed findings in the final report. Option C. Document the out-of-scope vulnerability and its exploitation in the final report, but do not inform the client until the report is delivered. Option D. Immediately cease all testing related to the out-of-scope vulnerability and promptly notify the client's designated point of contact about the discovery, awaiting their instructions on how to proceed. Correct answer is D. Immediately cease all testing related to the out-of-scope vulnerability and promptly notify the client's designated point of contact about the discovery, awaiting their instructions on how to proceed. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing where a tester discovers a vulnerability that, while technically exploitable, falls outside the explicitly defined scope of the engagement. The professional challenge lies in balancing the tester's ethical obligation to report potential risks with the contractual and legal boundaries of the engagement. Deviating from the agreed-upon scope without proper authorization can lead to legal repercussions, breach of contract, and damage to the client relationship. The tester must exercise careful judgment to navigate this situation ethically and professionally. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves immediately ceasing any further exploitation of the out-of-scope vulnerability and promptly notifying the client's designated point of contact. This aligns with the CompTIA PenTest plus exam's emphasis on adhering to legal and ethical frameworks, particularly those related to scope of work and client authorization. U.S. regulations, such as those governing data privacy and cybersecurity, often require explicit consent for any testing activities. Ethically, this approach demonstrates integrity and respect for the client's defined boundaries, preventing unauthorized access or actions that could be misconstrued as malicious. It allows the client to make an informed decision about how to proceed with the newly discovered risk. Incorrect approaches analysis. Continuing to exploit the out-of-scope vulnerability without explicit authorization is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It violates the principle of authorized access, which is fundamental to legal penetration testing. This action could be interpreted as unauthorized access under laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA, in the U.S., leading to severe legal penalties. It also breaches the contractual agreement, undermining trust and professionalism. Reporting the vulnerability only in the final report without immediate notification is also problematic. While the report is crucial, delaying notification of a critical out-of-scope finding deprives the client of timely awareness and the opportunity to mitigate the risk promptly. This can be seen as a failure in professional duty of care, as it potentially leaves the client exposed to threats for an extended period. Ignoring the vulnerability entirely because it is out of scope is a missed opportunity to provide value and uphold a broader ethical responsibility to identify and report significant risks. While scope adherence is paramount, a complete disregard for a discovered critical vulnerability, even if out of scope, can be ethically questionable if it poses a clear and present danger to the client's overall security posture. However, the primary professional and legal obligation remains within the defined scope. The correct approach prioritizes informing the client to allow them to decide on further action. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes clear communication and adherence to contractual agreements. When an out-of-scope vulnerability is discovered, the immediate steps should be: 1. Halt all testing related to that specific vulnerability. 2. Document the discovery and its potential impact. 3. Immediately inform the client's authorized representative, clearly stating that the finding is outside the agreed-upon scope but warrants attention. 4. Await explicit authorization from the client before proceeding with any further actions related to the out-of-scope finding. This process ensures legal compliance, ethical conduct, and maintains a strong client relationship. Question 6. The control framework reveals a vulnerability that allows an attacker to access and modify sensitive customer financial data stored on a web server. The penetration tester has successfully demonstrated the ability to both read and alter this data. What is the most appropriate next step in assessing the impact of this finding? Option A. Immediately escalate the finding as a critical data breach, regardless of the specific type of financial data involved. Option B. Assess the potential for denial of service attacks on the web server, as this is a common consequence of such vulnerabilities. Option C. Determine the sensitivity of the customer financial data and the potential business and regulatory consequences of its unauthorized disclosure or modification. Option D. Focus solely on the technical exploit path and document the steps taken to access and modify the data. The correct answer is C. Determine the sensitivity of the customer financial data and the potential business and regulatory consequences of its unauthorized disclosure or modification. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, where a discovered vulnerability has a potentially significant impact on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability (CIA) of sensitive data. The professional challenge lies in accurately assessing this impact without overstating or understating its severity, which directly influences the client's risk perception and subsequent remediation efforts. The tester must balance the technical findings with business context to provide actionable intelligence. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough impact assessment that quantifies the potential damage to the CIA triad. This means not just identifying that data could be exfiltrated, confidentiality breach, but also considering the sensitivity of that data, the potential for its misuse, and the regulatory implications, e.g., HIPAA, GDPR if applicable to the client's data. Similarly, for integrity, it's about understanding what kind of modifications could occur and their downstream effects. For availability, it's about the criticality of the affected systems to the business operations. This detailed assessment aligns with professional ethical obligation to provide accurate and relevant findings, enabling informed decision-making by the client. In the U.S. context, this aligns with NIST SB 800-53 controls that emphasize risk assessment and impact analysis for security controls. Incorrect approach is analysis. Focusing solely on the technical exploit without considering the business context is a failure. For example, simply stating that data can be read without understanding the sensitivity of that data or the potential regulatory fines for a breach, e.g., under U.S. federal or state data breach notification laws, is an incomplete assessment. This overlooks the business impact and the client's specific compliance obligations. Another failure is to assume the worst-case scenario without evidence. While it's important to highlight potential risks, overstating them without a clear path to that outcome can lead to unnecessary panic and misallocation of resources. This can also erode client trust. Furthermore, ignoring the availability aspect of the CIA triad, especially for critical systems, is a significant oversight. A system being compromised in a way that disrupts operations can have immediate and severe financial consequences, which must be factored into the overall impact. Professional reasoning. Penetration testers must adopt a risk-based approach. This involves understanding the client's business objectives, the data they handle, and their regulatory environment. The process should involve: 1. Identifying the vulnerability and the technical means of exploitation. 2. Determining the potential impact on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. 3. Quantifying this impact in business terms, e.g., financial loss, reputational damage, legal penalties. 4. Prioritizing findings based on this quantified risk. 5. Communicating these findings clearly and concisely to the client, providing actionable recommendations for remediation. This systematic approach ensures that the penetration test delivers maximum value by focusing on the most critical risks. Question 7. During the evaluation of a web application, a penetration tester observes multiple alerts from an automated vulnerability scanner indicating potential SQL injection flaws on various input fields. However, manual attempts to exploit these vulnerabilities using standard payloads are unsuccessful, and the application's responses do not exhibit the typical error messages or data leakage associated with successful SQL injection. The penetration tester also notes that the application's behavior appears consistent with its intended functionality, with no unexpected data being displayed or modified. Which of the following approaches best represents the professional and ethical handling of these findings? Option A. Immediately dismiss all scanner alerts as false positives, assuming the application is secure because manual exploitation failed. Option B. Manually verify each flagged input field by attempting to craft custom, more sophisticated injection payloads, and analyzing application behavior for subtle signs of data exfiltration or logic bypass. Option C. Focus solely on the scanner's confidence score for each alert, reporting only those with a high confidence score as potential vulnerabilities. Option D. Report all alerts generated by the automated scanner as confirmed vulnerabilities, advising the client to investigate and remediate each instance. The correct answer is D. Report all alerts generated by the automated scanner as confirmed vulnerabilities, advising the client to investigate and remediate each instance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, distinguishing between genuine security vulnerabilities and benign system behaviors or misconfigurations. The professional challenge lies in the potential for both overreporting false positives and underreporting false negatives. Overreporting can lead to wasted remediation efforts, decreased trust in the testing team, and alert fatigue for security operations teams. Underreporting, conversely, can leave critical vulnerabilities undiscovered, exposing the organization to significant risk. The need for meticulous analysis and validation is paramount to ensure the accuracy and value of the penetration test report. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic process of correlating findings from multiple tools and techniques, followed by manual verification and contextualization. This aligns with best practices in penetration testing, emphasizing thoroughness and accuracy. Specifically, it requires understanding the intended behavior of the systems under test and the potential impact of identified anomalies. By cross-referencing tool outputs with manual checks and considering the business context, a penetration tester can confidently differentiate between true positives and false positives/negatives. This methodical approach ensures that the final report accurately reflects the security posture of the organization, providing actionable intelligence for remediation and minimizing unnecessary disruption. In the context of U.S. regulations and common industry standards like those implicitly expected by CompTIA PenTest Plus, this rigorous validation is essential for demonstrating due diligence and providing a reliable assessment. Incorrect approaches analysis. Relying solely on automated tool output without manual verification is a significant ethical and professional failure. Automated tools, while powerful, are prone to generating false positives due to their signature-based or heuristic detection methods, which may misinterpret legitimate system activities as malicious. This leads to an inaccurate representation of the security landscape. Furthermore, it risks generating false negatives if the tools lack the necessary signatures or logic to detect a specific, novel, or cleverly disguised vulnerability. This directly violates the professional obligation to provide a comprehensive and accurate assessment, potentially leaving the client exposed to undetected threats. Accepting tool output at face value without considering the system's normal operating behavior or intended functionality is another critical failure. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the target environment and a failure to apply critical thinking. It can lead to misclassifying benign events as security incidents, wasting valuable client resources on unnecessary investigations and remediation. Ethically, this approach fails to deliver the expected value of a penetration test, which is to provide clear, actionable, and accurate security insights, failing to document the verification process and the rationale behind classifying findings as true or false positives/negatives is also professionally unacceptable. This lack of transparency hinders the client's ability to understand the test results and the remediation efforts required. It also prevents proper auditing and review of the penetration tester's methodology, undermining the credibility of the assessment. Professional standards require clear and reproducible methodologies. Professional reasoning. Professionals must adopt a mindset of critical evaluation. When presented with a finding, the initial step is to understand its origin, which tool or technique generated it. This is followed by an assessment of its potential impact. The next crucial step is verification. Can this finding be reproduced? Does it align with expected system behavior? If a finding is flagged by multiple tools or techniques, it increases its likelihood of being a true positive but still requires manual validation. The professional must constantly ask, is this a genuine security risk or is it a misinterpretation? This iterative process of correlation, validation, and contextualization is key to producing a high-quality, actionable penetration test report. Question 8. Market research demonstrates that organizations are increasingly concerned about the security implications of their expanding network infrastructure. During a penetration test conducted under U.S. regulatory guidelines and contractual agreements, you discover a previously unacknowledged and unapproved subnet that appears to be actively used. Your current statement of work, clearly defines the scope of the engagement, and this subnet is not included. What is the most professional and compliant course of action? Option A. Immediately cease testing on the unapproved subnet, document its existence and your discovery, and report it to your engagement manager for guidance on whether to proceed with testing it under a scope amendment. Option B. Document the discovery of the unapproved subnet, but do not report it until the end of the engagement to avoid disrupting the planned testing schedule. Option C. Ignore the unapproved subnet and continue with the original scope of the penetration test, as it is outside the defined boundaries. Option D. Proceed with testing the unapproved subnet to assess its security, as it represents a potential risk to the organization that should be identified. The correct answer is A. Immediately cease testing on the unapproved subnet, document its existence and your discovery, and report it to your engagement manager for guidance on whether to proceed with testing it under a scope amendment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need for comprehensive testing with the imperative to adhere to established security policies and legal frameworks. The challenge lies in interpreting the scope and limitations defined by these policies, especially when faced with potentially valuable but unapproved testing avenues. A penetration tester must navigate the fine line between thoroughness and unauthorized activity, which can have significant legal and professional repercussions. The organization's security policies are the primary guide, but their interpretation and application in dynamic testing environments require careful judgment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to the defined scope of the penetration test as outlined in the statement of work, and the organization's security policies. This ensures that all testing activities are authorized and fall within the agreed-upon boundaries. In the U.S., the legal framework for penetration testing is heavily influenced by contractual agreements and the organization's internal policies, which are often informed by regulations like NIST guidelines, e.g., NIST SB 800-115, Technical Guide to Information Security Testing and Assessment. Ethical conduct in penetration testing, as often guided by professional organizations and best practices, mandates operating within authorized parameters to avoid legal liabilities such as unauthorized access or data breaches. By documenting the discovery of the unapproved subnet and reporting it to the engagement manager for further authorization, the tester upholds professional integrity and legal compliance. This process ensures that any expansion of the test scope is formally approved, mitigating risks for both the tester and the client. Incorrect approaches analysis. Testing the unapproved subnet without explicit authorization represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. In the U.S., this could be construed as unauthorized access, violating laws such as the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA. Directly contravenes the principle of operating within the agreed-upon scope, which is a fundamental ethical requirement for penetration testers. Such an action bypasses the organization's established change control and authorization processes, undermining the trust placed in the penetration testing team. Failing to document the discovery of the unapproved subnet and proceeding with testing, it is also a critical failure. Documentation is essential for providing a clear audit trail and for the organization to understand the full extent of the testing performed. Without this, the organization cannot accurately assess risks or implement necessary remediation. Ethically, this omission is a breach of transparency and accountability. Ignoring the unapproved subnet entirely and continuing with the original scope, while seemingly compliant, is also an incomplete approach. While not an act of unauthorized access, it fails to provide the client with a complete picture of their security posture. The discovery of an unapproved, potentially vulnerable subnet is a significant finding that the client needs to be aware of, even if it falls outside the initial scope. The ethical obligation is to report all relevant findings, even if it requires a scope adjustment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based, policy-driven decision-making process. First, always prioritize understanding and adhering to the agreed-upon scope and the client's security policies. Second, if an unexpected but potentially significant finding arises, like an unapproved subnet, immediately pause and consult the engagement manager or designated point of contact. Third, document all findings meticulously, regardless of whether they are within the initial scope. Fourth, communicate transparently with the client about any discoveries that fall outside the original scope and discuss potential authorization for further testing. This approach ensures legal compliance, ethical conduct, and the delivery of maximum value to the client by providing a comprehensive security assessment. Question 9. To address the challenge of a client requesting a penetration test that includes a specific, potentially disruptive attack vector, which of the following actions best demonstrates professional responsibility and adherence to ethical and legal guidelines within the U.S. regulatory framework? Option A. Perform the attack vector as requested but omit detailed risk documentation, relying on the initial broad scope of the engagement for justification. Option B. Immediately execute the requested attack vector as per the client's instructions, assuming their authorization covers all potential outcomes. Option C. Refuse to perform the requested attack vector entirely, citing general security concerns without exploring alternatives or understanding the client's rationale. Option D. Conduct a thorough risk assessment of the requested attack vector, document all potential impacts and necessary mitigation steps, and obtain explicit written authorization from the client for that specific action before proceeding. The correct answer is B. Immediately execute the requested attack vector as per the client's instructions, assuming their authorization covers all potential outcomes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a significant ethical and professional challenge for a penetration tester. The core dilemma lies in balancing the client's explicit request for a specific, potentially risky attack vector with the tester's professional responsibility to conduct the assessment safely and ethically, while adhering to the scope and legal boundaries. The tester must consider the potential for unintended consequences, data loss, or system disruption, even if the client has authorized the action. The challenge is amplified by the need to maintain client trust while also upholding professional integrity and legal compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a thorough risk assessment and clear communication before proceeding. This aligns with the ethical principles of responsible disclosure and due diligence inherent in professional penetration testing, particularly within the U.S. regulatory framework, which emphasizes informed consent and minimizing harm. By documenting the risks, obtaining explicit written approval for the specific attack, and ensuring appropriate mitigation or rollback plans are in place, the tester demonstrates a commitment to professional best practices. This approach ensures that the client is fully aware of the potential ramifications and has made an informed decision, thereby protecting both the client and the tester from legal and reputational damage. It also adheres to the spirit of the U.S. legal landscape concerning unauthorized access and damage, ensuring that all actions taken are within the agreed-upon scope and with explicit consent. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately executing the requested attack without further assessment. This is ethically unsound and legally risky. It bypasses the crucial step of risk evaluation, potentially leading to unintended damage or data breaches that were not fully contemplated by the client. From a U.S. legal perspective, This could be construed as reckless endangerment of the client's systems and data, potentially violating statutes related to unauthorized access or damage if the attack goes awry, even if initially authorized in broad terms. Another incorrect approach is to refuse the request outright, without attempting to understand the client's underlying objectives or offering alternative, less risky methods. Caution is warranted. A complete refusal without exploration can damage the client relationship and may not fully address the client's security concerns. Ethically, a penetration tester should strive to meet client needs within safe and legal boundaries. Legally, while refusing a risky engagement is permissible, failing to offer alternatives might be seen as a lack of professional service, though not a direct violation of law. A third incorrect approach is to proceed with the attack, but without detailed documentation of the risks and explicit written authorization for that specific vector. This leaves the tester vulnerable to accusations of negligence or exceeding the scope of engagement if issues arise. It fails to meet the standard of informed consent required by ethical guidelines and could be problematic under U.S. law if the client later disputes the scope or consequences of the testing. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always begin by thoroughly understanding the client's objectives and the scope of the engagement. When a client requests a specific, potentially high-risk action, the professional's duty is to conduct a comprehensive risk assessment. This assessment should identify potential impacts, likelihood of success, and necessary mitigation strategies. The findings must be clearly communicated to the client, detailing the specific risks associated with the requested attack vector. The professional should then obtain explicit, written authorization for that particular action, ensuring the client fully comprehends and accepts the associated risks. If the risks are deemed unacceptable or cannot be adequately mitigated, the professional should propose alternative, safer methods to achieve the client's security goals. This process ensures that all testing is conducted ethically, legally, and with the client's informed consent, protecting all parties involved. Question 10. Regulatory review indicates that a penetration tester has been engaged to assess the security posture of a client's external network. During the initial reconnaissance phase, the tester identifies the client's public-facing DNS servers. The tester is considering several methods to enumerate DNS records to gain a better understanding of the client's network infrastructure. Which of the following approaches best adheres to ethical and regulatory guidelines for penetration testing? Option A. Directly querying internal DNS servers from the Internet without a VPN or specific authorization to access the internal network. Option B. Attempting zone transfers from any publicly accessible DNS server associated with the client's domain without prior explicit permission. Option C. Employing brute force methods to guess a wide range of DNS records, including subdomains and hostnames, without a defined strategy or client approval for such aggressive techniques. Option D. Utilizing publicly available DNS records and performing passive enumeration techniques, or actively requesting zone transfers from authoritative DNS servers only after obtaining explicit client consent for such actions. The correct answer is B. Attempting zone transfers from any publicly accessible DNS server associated with the client's domain without prior explicit permission. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common ethical dilemma in penetration testing, specifically concerning DNS enumeration. The challenge lies in balancing the need to gather comprehensive information for a thorough assessment, with the legal and ethical boundaries of accessing or inferring information that might be considered private or proprietary, even if publicly accessible through technical means. The tester must navigate the potential for unintended consequences or misinterpretations of their actions by the client or other stakeholders. The core of the challenge is to perform the assessment effectively without crossing lines that could lead to legal repercussions or damage the client relationship. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves leveraging publicly available DNS records and employing passive enumeration techniques. This aligns with the principle of least privilege and the ethical obligation to operate within the scope of engagement and legal frameworks. Using tools that query public DNS servers, like OpenNIC, Google DNS, or Cloudflare DNS, to gather zone transfer information, or performing zone transfers from authoritative servers with explicit permission, is standard practice. This method respects the client's infrastructure by not actively probing internal systems without authorization and adheres to the implicit understanding that penetration testing is a simulated attack within defined boundaries. The CompTIA PenTest Plus exam emphasizes performing tests ethically and legally, and this approach directly reflects that. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves attempting zone transfers from any DNS server without explicit authorization. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it constitutes unauthorized access to potentially sensitive information, even if the DNS server is misconfigured to allow zone transfers to the public. Actively exploiting such a misconfiguration without prior client consent can be construed as a breach of trust and potentially illegal depending on the jurisdiction's computer misuse laws. Another incorrect approach is to directly query internal DNS servers from the internet without a VPN or explicit network access. This violates the scope of engagement and could be interpreted as an attempt to gain unauthorized access to the internal network, which is a clear ethical and legal transgression. Finally, using brute force techniques to guess DNS records without a clear understanding of the target's DNS structure or without prior authorization can be overly aggressive and may trigger security alerts, potentially jeopardizing the test and the client's security posture. This approach lacks the precision and ethical consideration expected of a professional penetration tester. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always begin by thoroughly understanding the scope of work and obtaining explicit written authorization for all testing activities. When performing DNS enumeration, the decision-making process should prioritize passive reconnaissance and publicly accessible information. If active enumeration is required, it must be explicitly included in the scope and authorized by the client. Testers should maintain a clear audit trail of all actions taken and be prepared to justify their methods based on the agreed-upon objectives and ethical guidelines. In cases of ambiguity, seeking clarification from the client is paramount. The CompTIA PenTest Plus framework stresses the importance of ethical conduct, legal compliance, and professional responsibility throughout the penetration testing lifecycle. Question 11. The performance metrics show a significant degradation in critical service availability immediately following the initial reconnaissance phase of a penetration test. The client's business operations are heavily reliant on these services. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the penetration testing team? Option A. Attempt to troubleshoot and resolve the performance issues independently before proceeding with further testing to minimize disruption. Option B. Ignore the performance metrics and proceed with the original testing plan, as the reconnaissance phase is typically low impact. Option C. Immediately cease all further intrusive testing activities and initiate clear, documented communication with the client to report the observed impact and discuss next steps. Option D. Continue with the planned intrusive testing to identify the root cause of the performance degradation, assuming it is a vulnerability that needs to be discovered. The correct answer is C. Immediately cease all further intrusive testing activities and initiate clear, documented communication with the client to report the observed impact and discuss next steps. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need for comprehensive testing with the client's operational constraints and potential impact. The performance metrics indicating a significant degradation in critical services immediately after the initial reconnaissance phase highlight the sensitivity of the client's environment. This requires the penetration tester to exercise extreme caution and a high degree of judgment to avoid causing further disruption, which could have severe business and reputational consequences for the client. The tester must not only identify vulnerabilities, but also do so in a manner that minimizes risk and adheres to the agreed-upon scope and rules of engagement. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves immediately ceasing further intrusive testing and initiating a clear, documented communication protocol with the client. This aligns with best professional practices and regulatory expectations, particularly within the U.S. framework governing cybersecurity and data protection. The U.S. has a strong emphasis on responsible disclosure and minimizing harm during security assessments. By pausing and reporting, the tester demonstrates adherence to the principle of do no harm and upholds the ethical obligation to protect the client's operational integrity. This proactive communication allows for a collaborative decision-making process with the client to determine the next steps, whether that involves adjusting the testing methodology, focusing on less impactful techniques, or temporarily halting the engagement. This approach ensures that the testing remains within the spirit of the agreed-upon scope, which implicitly includes avoiding significant operational disruption and respects the client's ultimate control over their systems. Incorrect approach is analysis. Continuing the testing without explicit client approval after observing performance degradation is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. It violates the principle of informed consent and can lead to accusations of negligence or malicious intent. From a U.S. regulatory perspective, such actions could potentially contravene aspects of data breach notification laws if the disruption leads to data unavailability or compromise, or even violate contractual obligations if the testing causes damage beyond the agreed scope. Ignoring the performance metrics and proceeding with the planned intrusive tests is equally problematic. This demonstrates a lack of situational awareness and a disregard for the client's operational stability. It prioritizes the tester's agenda over the client's business continuity, which is a fundamental breach of professional responsibility. This could lead to legal repercussions for the penetration testing firm if the client suffers financial losses due to the disruption. Attempting to fix the performance issues without client authorization before continuing testing is also an unacceptable approach. This oversteps the boundaries of a penetration test, which is designed to identify vulnerabilities, not to perform remediation. Such actions could introduce new vulnerabilities or mask existing ones, rendering the test results inaccurate and potentially causing further instability. It also bypasses the client's IT and security teams, undermining their authority and responsibilities. Professional reasoning. Professionals in penetration testing must adopt a risk-based approach that prioritizes client safety and operational continuity. The decision-making process should involve 1. Continuous monitoring of the target environment for any unexpected impacts. 2. Immediate cessation of potentially harmful activities upon observing adverse effects. 3. Prompt and transparent communication with the client, providing clear details of the observed impact and potential causes. 4. Collaborative decision-making with the client to determine the appropriate course of action, which may include scope adjustments, methodology changes, or pausing the engagement. 5. Thorough documentation of all observations, communications, and decisions made throughout the engagement. This systematic approach ensures that the penetration test is conducted ethically, legally, and effectively, delivering valuable security insights without causing undue harm. Question 12. Governance review demonstrates that while a penetration testing engagement has been authorized, the scope document for identifying target systems and networks is vague regarding the exact IP address ranges and external-facing assets to be assessed. Which approach to identifying target systems and networks best aligns with U.S. regulatory frameworks and professional ethical standards for penetration testers? Option A. Conduct broad, unannounced network scans across all available Internet IP address blocks to identify any potential client assets, assuming a broad mandate for discovery. Option B. Prioritize reconnaissance of publicly accessible IP address ranges that appear to be associated with the client's organization, even if not explicitly listed in the scope document, to ensure comprehensive discovery. Option C. Attempt to gain access to internal client documentation or employee credentials through social engineering tactics to identify additional target systems not explicitly mentioned in the scope. Option D. Focus initial target identification on information readily available through open-source intelligence (OSINT) and leverage authorized internal network scanning tools provided by the client to map the internal and external attack surface. The correct answer is B. Prioritize reconnaissance of publicly accessible IP address ranges that appear to be associated with the client's organization, even if not explicitly listed in the scope document, to ensure comprehensive discovery. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need for comprehensive target identification with the imperative to operate within defined legal and ethical boundaries. The professional challenge lies in accurately and exhaustively mapping an organization's digital footprint without inadvertently encroaching on systems or data that fall outside the agreed-upon scope of the engagement. This requires meticulous planning, clear communication, and a robust understanding of the client's environment and the legal framework governing such activities. The correct approach, which involves utilizing publicly available information and authorized internal reconnaissance tools, represents best professional practice because it adheres strictly to the principle of least privilege and explicit authorization. By focusing on information that is either openly accessible or provided through authorized channels. Penetration tester ensures that all discovery activities are conducted within the bounds of the engagement scope and legal permissions. This aligns with the ethical obligation to avoid unauthorized access and respects the client's defined boundaries, preventing potential legal repercussions and maintaining client trust. In the U.S. context, this approach is consistent with the spirit of laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act (CFA), which prohibits unauthorized access by ensuring that all access and discovery methods are explicitly permitted. An incorrect approach that involves scanning external IP ranges not explicitly provided by the client is professionally unacceptable due to significant regulatory and ethical failures. Such an action constitutes unauthorized access and reconnaissance, violating the CFA and potentially other state-level computer crime statutes. Ethically, it breaches the trust placed in the penetration tester by the client and could lead to severe legal consequences for both the tester and the client. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to exploit publicly accessible but unpatched systems without prior authorization, also represents a critical regulatory and ethical failure. While identifying vulnerabilities is a core part of penetration testing, forming active exploitation without explicit permission crosses the line from authorized testing to unauthorized intrusion. This directly contravenes the CFA and the Ethical Code of Conduct for Cybersecurity Professionals, which mandates operating strictly within the defined scope and with explicit client consent for all testing activities. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a rigorous scope definition phase. This includes obtaining a clear, written authorization that precisely delineates the IP addresses, network segments, and types of systems that are in scope for the penetration test. Before commencing any reconnaissance or testing activities, professionals must verify that their planned methods and tools are aligned with this scope and any contractual limitations. If ambiguity exists, clarification must be sought from the client before proceeding. Continuous communication with the client throughout the engagement is also crucial, allowing for adjustments to the scope if necessary and ensuring ongoing alignment with organizational policies and legal requirements. Question 13. Implementation of a threat modeling process for a financial services client operating under U.S. regulatory requirements. What approach best optimizes the delivery of actionable security insights while remaining compliant and ethically sound? Option A. Develop an extremely detailed and theoretical threat model that explores every conceivable attack vector, regardless of its practical applicability or the client's capacity to implement the recommended countermeasures. Option B. Begin with a comprehensive understanding of the client's business operations, data flows, and trust boundaries. Then iteratively identify, analyze, and prioritize threats based on their potential impact and likelihood within the specific regulatory context, leading to tailored mitigation strategies. Option C. Focus solely on documenting known technical vulnerabilities discovered during initial scans, neglecting the broader context of how these vulnerabilities could be exploited to achieve business-impacting objectives or the specific regulatory implications. Option D. Utilize a generic threat catalog and apply it broadly across all systems, focusing primarily on identifying common technical vulnerabilities without deep consideration for the client's specific business processes or regulatory obligations. The correct answer is B. Begin with a comprehensive understanding of the client's business operations, data flows, and trust boundaries, then iteratively identify, analyze, and prioritize threats based on their potential impact and likelihood within the specific regulatory context, leading to tailored mitigation strategies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need for thorough threat modeling with the practical constraints of project timelines and client expectations. The core difficulty lies in determining the optimal level of detail and the most effective methodology to ensure the threat model accurately reflects the client's unique environment and potential threats, without becoming an overly burdensome or theoretical exercise. The penetration tester must exercise professional judgment to deliver actionable intelligence that aligns with the client's business objectives and risk appetite, all while adhering to ethical and legal boundaries. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased, iterative threat modeling process that begins with understanding the target system's architecture, data flows, and trust boundaries. This foundational understanding is then used to identify potential threats, vulnerabilities, and attack vectors relevant to the specific business context and regulatory landscape, e.g., U.S. regulations like NIST SB 800-30 for risk assessment, and potentially HIPAA or PCI DSS if applicable to the client's industry. The process should prioritize threats based on their likelihood and potential impact, leading to the development of specific, actionable recommendations for mitigation. This iterative refinement ensures that the threat model remains relevant and practical, providing the client with a clear roadmap for improving their security posture. This aligns with the ethical obligation to provide competent and relevant services and the professional standard of delivering value to the client. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on generic threat libraries without tailoring them to the client's specific environment and business context. This fails to identify unique or context-specific threats, leading to an incomplete and potentially misleading threat model. Ethically, this represents a failure to provide competent service and could result in the client overlooking critical risks. Another incorrect approach is to focus exclusively on technical vulnerabilities without considering the business impact or the human element of security. Threat modeling is not just about finding flaws. It's about understanding how those flaws can be exploited to achieve malicious objectives that harm the business. This approach neglects the broader risk landscape and can lead to recommendations that are technically sound but strategically irrelevant. This is an ethical failure as it does not adequately address the client's overall security posture. A third incorrect approach is to create an overly complex and theoretical threat model that is difficult for the client to understand or implement. While thoroughness is important, the output must be actionable. A threat model that is too abstract or requires extensive resources to comprehend and act upon fails to deliver practical value. This can be seen as a failure in professional communication and a disregard for the client's ability to operationalize the findings, potentially violating the principle of providing useful and relevant services. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach threat modeling by first establishing a clear understanding of the client's business objectives, critical assets, and existing security controls. This context-driven approach allows for the prioritization of threats that pose the greatest risk. The methodology should be adaptable, allowing for the incorporation of various techniques such as stride, dread, or PASTA, but always with the goal of producing actionable insights. Regular communication with the client throughout the process is crucial to ensure alignment and to validate assumptions. The final output should be a clear, concise report that outlines identified threats, their potential impact, and prioritized recommendations for mitigation, presented in a manner that facilitates understanding and implementation by the client's stakeholders. Question 14. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a target organization has a significant online presence across various social media platforms, with many employees actively sharing professional and personal information. As a penetration tester, what is the most appropriate method to gather intelligence from these platforms to identify potential social engineering vulnerabilities? Option A. Attempt to directly message employees on social media platforms, posing as a colleague or vendor, to elicit sensitive company information. Option B. Join private social media groups associated with the organization or its employees to observe discussions and gather intelligence. Option C. Analyze publicly accessible employee profiles and their associated metadata for patterns, connections, and publicly shared work-related information that could be leveraged for social engineering. Option D. Scrape all available data from employee social media profiles, regardless of its relevance to the penetration test, to build a comprehensive database of personal details. Correct answer is C. Analyze publicly accessible employee profiles and their associated metadata for patterns, connections, and publicly shared work-related information that could be leveraged for social engineering. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a penetration tester to balance the need for comprehensive reconnaissance with the ethical and legal boundaries of data collection, particularly concerning publicly available information that may still be sensitive or subject to privacy considerations. The challenge lies in identifying actionable intelligence without crossing into unauthorized access or violating privacy norms. Even when the data is ostensibly public, the tester must exercise judgment to distinguish between legitimate open-source intelligence, OSINT, gathering and activities that could be misconstrued or lead to legal repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves leveraging publicly accessible social media profiles and associated metadata to identify potential attack vectors, such as employee relationships, common interests, or publicly shared work-related information that could be exploited in social engineering. This aligns with the ethical and legal principles of penetration testing, which permit the examination of publicly available information. In the U.S. context, this falls under the umbrella of lawful reconnaissance, provided no unauthorized access is attempted and no personally identifiable information, PI, is misused or retained beyond the scope of the engagement. The focus remains on identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited through social engineering, a common objective in penetration tests. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves attempting to directly interact with social media accounts to solicit information or gain access, even if the accounts appear to belong to employees. This crosses the line from passive reconnaissance to active engagement, potentially violating terms of service, privacy policies, and even laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA, if it leads to unauthorized access or misrepresentation. Another incorrect approach is to scrape or aggregate large volumes of personal data from social media profiles without a clear, documented, and authorized purpose related to the penetration test's objectives. This can lead to privacy violations and potential legal liabilities, as it may exceed the scope of what is considered permissible OSINT for security testing. Furthermore, analyzing private groups or non-publicly accessible content, even if discovered through indirect means, constitutes unauthorized access and is a clear ethical and legal breach. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a phased approach to social media analysis during penetration testing. First, clearly define the scope and objectives of the social media reconnaissance with the client, ensuring all activities are authorized and documented. Second, focus on publicly available information that directly relates to potential social engineering vectors or organizational vulnerabilities. Third, employ tools and techniques that respect privacy and terms of service, avoiding any actions that could be construed as unauthorized access or data misuse. Finally, always maintain a clear audit trail of data collected and the methods used, and ensure all findings are reported responsibly and ethically to the client. Question 15. Market research demonstrates that organizations are increasingly vulnerable to distributed denial of service, DDoS, attacks, which can cripple their online services. As a penetration tester operating under U.S. federal law and common ethical guidelines, you are tasked with assessing an organization's resilience to such threats. Your engagement letter clearly defines the scope of testing, which includes internal network infrastructure and specific public-facing web applications, but explicitly prohibits any actions that could cause actual service disruption or damage to the client's systems or their customers. You need to effectively demonstrate the potential impact of a DDoS attack without violating the terms of your engagement or U.S. law. Which of the following approaches best fulfills this requirement? Option A. Rely solely on theoretical explanations and reports detailing how DDoS attacks work and their potential impact, without performing any practical simulation. Option B. Launch a full-scale, unmitigated DDoS attack against the target infrastructure for a short duration to immediately highlight the severity of the vulnerability. Option C. Utilize publicly available, unverified botnet services to launch a simulated DDoS attack against the client's public-facing web applications to mimic a real-world scenario. Option D. Conduct a controlled simulation of a DDoS attack by generating a high volume of traffic from a limited number of authorized testing machines within the client's network, targeting specific, pre-approved services, and employing rate-limiting techniques to prevent actual service degradation. The correct answer is D. Conduct a controlled simulation of a DDoS attack by generating a high volume of traffic from a limited number of authorized testing machines within the client's network, targeting specific, pre-approved services, and employing rate-limiting techniques to prevent actual service degradation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because a penetration tester must balance the immediate need to demonstrate the impact of a potential DDoS attack with the critical requirement of adhering to legal and ethical boundaries. The core tension lies in simulating a disruptive event without causing actual harm or violating the terms of engagement, which are implicitly governed by U.S. federal laws and common ethical guidelines for penetration testing. The tester must consider the potential for unintended consequences, the scope of authorization, and the legal ramifications of exceeding that scope. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves simulating a DDoS attack using techniques that mimic the traffic patterns and volume of a real attack, but are carefully controlled and limited in scope. This includes employing rate limiting, using a limited number of testing machines within the authorized network, and focusing on specific services or applications identified in the scope. This method represents best professional practice because it effectively demonstrates the vulnerability to a DDoS attack without causing actual service disruption or violating the law. It aligns with the principle of authorized testing, ensuring that all actions are within the agreed-upon scope and do not infringe upon the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act (CFA) by causing damage or unauthorized access. Ethical guidelines for penetration testing, such as those promoted by organizations like ISACA, emphasize minimizing harm and operating within defined boundaries. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves launching a full-scale, unmitigated DDoS attack against the target infrastructure, even if it's intended to be brief. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure because it directly violates the CFA by causing damage, service unavailability, and potentially unauthorized access if the attack triggers emergency responses or security measures that lock out legitimate users. It also breaches the fundamental principle of authorized testing, as the scope of engagement would be exceeded, leading to potential legal liability for the tester and their organization. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on theoretical explanations and reports without any form of practical demonstration, even a controlled one. While this avoids legal issues, it fails to professionally meet the objective of demonstrating the impact of a DDoS attack. A penetration test aims to provide actionable insights through practical validation. Without a controlled simulation, the client may not fully grasp the severity of the vulnerability, leading to a less effective remediation effort. This approach, while not directly illegal, represents a professional failure to deliver the full value expected from a penetration test. A third incorrect approach is to use publicly available, unverified botnet services to launch the simulated attack. This is a severe regulatory and ethical failure. It not only risks causing widespread disruption beyond the intended target, potentially violating the CFA for other entities, but also involves engaging with potentially illegal or compromised infrastructure. Furthermore, it demonstrates a lack of control and professionalism, as the tester cannot guarantee the origin, nature, or ultimate impact of the attack, making it impossible to attribute the results accurately or ethically. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes understanding and adhering to the scope of engagement and applicable laws. This involves a thorough review of the contract and legal frameworks, particularly the CFA in the U.S. context, before commencing any testing. When simulating disruptive attacks like DDoS, the process should include 1. Defining clear, measurable objectives for the simulation. 2. Developing a detailed plan for controlled execution, including specific tools, targets within the scope, and mitigation strategies for the test itself. 3. Obtaining explicit written approval for the simulation plan from the client. And 4. Continuously monitoring the test to ensure it remains within the approved parameters and does not cause unintended harm. If at any point the simulation risks exceeding the scope or causing undue disruption, the tester must be prepared to halt the activity immediately and consult with the client. Question 16. Quality control measures reveal a discrepancy between a vulnerability identified by the client's internal security team and a vulnerability identified during your penetration test. The client's team claims the vulnerability is a false positive based on their internal analysis, while your team's initial assessment indicates it is a genuine risk. What is the most professional and compliant course of action to resolve this difference? Option A. Initiate a collaborative review session with the client's security team to compare methodologies, evidence, and reevaluate the specific finding together. Option B. Conclude that the client's internal assessment is correct and remove the finding from your report without further investigation or discussion. Option C. Immediately adjust the penetration test report to align with the client's internal assessment, assuming their expertise in their own environment. Option D. Inform the client's senior management about the disagreement, framing it as a potential oversight by their internal team, without first attempting direct resolution. The correct answer is A. Initiate a collaborative review session with the client's security team to compare methodologies, evidence, and reevaluate the specific finding together. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing where the client's internal security team has identified a vulnerability, but the penetration tester's findings differ. This discrepancy requires careful professional judgment to reconcile potentially conflicting information, ensure accurate reporting, and maintain client trust. The challenge lies in validating findings without undermining the client's existing processes or creating unnecessary alarm. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a collaborative effort to validate the findings. The penetration tester should work with the client's security team to understand their methodology, review their evidence, and then reevaluate their own findings. This aligns with professional ethical standards that emphasize accuracy, integrity, and client cooperation. Specifically, within the U.S. regulatory framework relevant to penetration testing, e.g., NIST guidelines and common industry best practices that inform compliance with regulations like HIPAA or PCI DSS. The expectation is for testers to provide verifiable and accurate information. A collaborative validation process ensures that the final report is a true reflection of the security posture, minimizing false positives and false negatives, which is crucial for effective risk management and compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's findings outright without thorough investigation. This demonstrates a lack of professionalism and disrespect for the client's internal efforts. Ethically, it violates the principle of cooperation and can damage the client relationship. From a regulatory perspective, failing to investigate a potential discrepancy could lead to an incomplete or inaccurate assessment, which might have downstream compliance implications if the client relies on the penetration test report for regulatory adherence. Another incorrect approach is to immediately escalate the discrepancy to senior management without attempting internal resolution. While escalation is sometimes necessary, doing so prematurely bypasses a critical step in professional problem solving and can be perceived as an attempt to win an argument rather than solve a problem. This can create unnecessary friction and undermine the collaborative spirit expected in client engagements. Regulatory frameworks often encourage efficient and effective communication, and premature escalation hinders this. A third incorrect approach is to simply adjust the penetration test report to match the client's findings without independent verification. This compromises the integrity of the penetration testing process and the accuracy of the report. It is a form of data manipulation that is ethically unacceptable and could lead to a false sense of security for the client, potentially violating due diligence requirements and leading to non-compliance with security standards. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such discrepancies with a mindset of collaborative problem solving. The decision-making process should involve 1. Acknowledging the discrepancy and the client's findings. 2. Initiating a dialogue with the client's security team to understand their methodology and evidence. 3. Conducting a targeted reevaluation of the penetration tester's own findings, potentially using different tools or techniques. 4. Documenting all steps taken and the rationale for the final conclusion. 5. Communicating the reconciled findings clearly and professionally to the client. This systematic approach ensures accuracy, maintains trust, and upholds professional and ethical obligations. Question 17. Investigation of a newly implemented acceptable use policy, AUP, reveals a significant gap between the policy's stated objectives and employee adherence. The organization, operating within the United States, needs to improve the effectiveness of its AUP communication and enforcement. Which of the following strategies would best address this implementation challenge while adhering to U.S. regulatory and ethical standards? Option A. Conduct mandatory, interactive training sessions for all employees, tailored to different roles and responsibilities, followed by a clear communication plan that includes regular reminders and accessible resources for policy clarification. Option B. Post the AUP on a publicly accessible section of the company website and require employees to acknowledge receipt without further explanation or training. Option C. Distribute the AUP via email to all employees with a disclaimer that reading and understanding the policy is the sole responsibility of each individual. Option D. Implement a system of immediate, severe disciplinary action for any employee found to be in violation of any clause in the AUP, regardless of prior awareness or intent. The correct answer is A. Conduct mandatory, interactive training sessions for all employees, tailored to different roles and responsibilities, followed by a clear communication plan that includes regular reminders and accessible resources for policy clarification. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge where a newly developed acceptable use policy, AUP, needs to be effectively communicated and enforced across a diverse workforce. The challenge lies in balancing the need for clear guidelines with the practicalities of user adoption and the potential for resistance or misunderstanding. Ensuring that the AUP is not just a document but a living, understood, and followed standard requires strategic planning and execution, especially when dealing with varying levels of technical proficiency and differing departmental needs. Correct approach analysis. The most effective approach involves a multifaceted communication and training strategy. This includes clearly articulating the purpose and scope of the AUP, providing accessible training materials tailored to different user groups, and establishing clear channels for questions and feedback. This aligns with best practices for cybersecurity awareness and compliance, as it fosters understanding and buy-in, thereby increasing the likelihood of adherence. From a U.S. regulatory perspective, this proactive approach supports compliance with frameworks like NIST SB 800-53, which emphasizes security awareness and training as critical components of an organization's security program. It also addresses the ethical obligation to inform users of their responsibilities and the potential consequences of misuse. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply post the AUP on the company intranet and assume all employees will read and understand it. This fails to acknowledge the diverse learning styles and time constraints of employees, leading to potential noncompliance due to lack of awareness rather than intent. Ethically, it is insufficient to merely make information available without ensuring comprehension. From a regulatory standpoint, this passive approach would likely not meet the requirements for effective security awareness training mandated by various U.S. regulations and standards. Another incorrect approach is to implement the AUP with immediate, strict penalties for any minor infraction, without prior education or a grace period. This can breed resentment and a perception of unfairness, undermining the policy's effectiveness and potentially leading to employees circumventing the rules rather than adhering to them. This approach is not only poor professional practice, but also ethically questionable, as it lacks proportionality and fails to educate users before penalizing them. It also fails to align with the spirit of compliance frameworks that encourage a culture of security. A third incorrect approach is to delegate the entire responsibility of AUP communication and enforcement to the IT department, without involving other stakeholders like HR or legal. This can lead to a policy that is technically sound, but lacks broader organizational context or support, making it difficult to enforce consistently across all departments. It also overlooks the importance of HR in disciplinary actions and legal in ensuring compliance with all applicable laws. This siloed approach is professionally inefficient and can create gaps in both understanding and enforcement. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach AUP implementation by first understanding the organization's specific context, including its culture, existing policies, and the technical landscape. A comprehensive strategy should involve collaboration with relevant departments, clear and accessible communication, tailored training, and a phased enforcement plan. This ensures that the AUP is understood, accepted, and effectively integrated into daily operations, fostering a strong security posture and mitigating risks. The decision-making process should prioritize education, transparency, and a balanced approach to enforcement, aligning with both regulatory requirements and ethical considerations. Question 18. Compliance review shows that a penetration tester has discovered a critical zero-day vulnerability in a widely used open-source library that is integrated into numerous commercial products. The tester is considering how to proceed with disclosing this finding. Which of the following actions represents the most professionally responsible and ethically sound approach, adhering to common U.S. cybersecurity disclosure principles? Option A. Immediately publish all technical details of the vulnerability and proof-of-concept exploit code on a public security forum to alert the wider community. Option B. Contact the maintainers of the open-source library directly and privately, providing them with detailed information about the vulnerability and a reasonable time frame to develop and release a patch before any public disclosure. Option C. Sell the vulnerability details to the highest bidder on the dark web to recoup research costs and profit from the discovery. Option D. Inform a small, select group of trusted cybersecurity researchers and vendors about the vulnerability to gauge their interest and potential solutions. The correct answer is A. Immediately publish all technical details of the vulnerability and proof-of-concept exploit code on a public security forum to alert the wider community. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in vulnerability research where a newly discovered vulnerability in a widely used open-source component could have significant downstream impacts. The professional challenge lies in balancing the urgency of disclosure with the responsibility to ensure responsible and coordinated disclosure practices, especially when dealing with a component that underpins many other systems. The need for careful judgment stems from the potential for both widespread harm if exploited before patching, and for disruption or panic if disclosed prematurely or irresponsibly. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a structured and responsible disclosure process aligned with industry, best practices, and ethical considerations prevalent in the U.S. regulatory landscape for cybersecurity. This involves privately notifying the maintainers of the open-source project first, providing them with sufficient time and details to develop and test a patch. This approach respects the intellectual property and development efforts of the open-source community and allows for a coordinated release of information, minimizing the window of opportunity for malicious actors. It aligns with the spirit of initiatives like the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, guidelines on vulnerability disclosure, which promote collaboration and timely remediation. This method prioritizes minimizing harm to end users by ensuring that a solution is available or imminent before public disclosure. Incorrect approaches analysis. Disclosing the vulnerability immediately and publicly without prior notification to the project maintainers is a significant ethical and professional failure. This approach, often termed full disclosure without coordination, can lead to widespread exploitation by attackers before a patch is available, directly violating the principle of minimizing harm. It also demonstrates a lack of respect for the open-source development process and can damage trust within the cybersecurity community. Such an action could be seen as negligent, as it actively exposes vulnerable systems to risk without attempting to mitigate it through responsible channels. Attempting to monetize the vulnerability by selling it to a third party before any disclosure or remediation efforts is a clear ethical breach and potentially illegal depending on specific laws regarding the exploitation of vulnerabilities. This action prioritizes personal gain over public safety and security, directly contravening the ethical obligations of a cybersecurity professional. It also undermines the collaborative nature of vulnerability research and could be construed as aiding malicious actors. Contacting only a select group of security researchers or companies without informing the original project maintainers is also an irresponsible approach. While it might seem like a way to get the vulnerability fixed, it bypasses the primary responsible party and can lead to fragmented or uncoordinated patching efforts. It also risks the information leaking prematurely or being misused by the contacted parties, again, increasing the risk to end users. This approach lacks the systematic and comprehensive coordination that is essential for effective vulnerability management. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes responsible disclosure and minimizing harm. This framework involves 1. Verification, thoroughly verifying the vulnerability and its potential impact. 2. Identification of stakeholders, identifying the developers of the affected software and relevant security organizations. 3. Private notification, privately notifying the developers with detailed technical information and a reasonable timeline for remediation. 4. Collaboration, working with developers to ensure a patch is developed and tested. 5. Coordinated disclosure, planning a public disclosure strategy that aligns with the availability of patches, often through established vulnerability disclosure programs or advisories. This systematic approach ensures that the cybersecurity community can effectively address the threat while protecting end users. Question 19. When evaluating a critical vulnerability discovered during a penetration test that has the potential to impact production systems, and the client has explicitly instructed to avoid any disruption to live operations, which of the following actions represents the most professional and compliant approach? Option A. Immediately inform the client of the critical vulnerability and its potential impact, and await their explicit instructions on how to proceed, potentially including a controlled demonstration or a decision to accept the risk for the assessment's duration. Option B. Proceed with a full exploitation attempt to demonstrate the severity of the vulnerability, assuming the client would prefer to see the worst-case scenario, even if it risks impacting production systems. Option C. Attempt to exploit the vulnerability in a separate, isolated lab environment that is not part of the agreed-upon scope to gather more data without directly touching the production systems. Option D. Document the vulnerability but refrain from any further action or reporting on it, as the risk of impacting production systems is too high and it falls outside the explicit directive to avoid disruption. The correct answer is A. Immediately inform the client of the critical vulnerability and its potential impact, and await their explicit instructions on how to proceed, potentially including a controlled demonstration or a decision to accept the risk for the assessment's duration. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing, balancing the need for thorough vulnerability analysis with the potential for operational disruption. The client's explicit instruction to avoid impacting production systems, coupled with the discovery of a critical vulnerability that could potentially affect them, creates a direct conflict. The professional challenge lies in making a judgment call that upholds the integrity of the assessment while respecting the client's operational constraints and legal/ethical obligations. This requires a deep understanding of risk assessment, communication protocols, and the scope of the engagement. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes immediate, controlled communication with the client regarding the critical vulnerability and its potential impact. This aligns with best professional practices and regulatory expectations for responsible disclosure. In the U.S., frameworks like NIST SB 800-115, Technical Guide to Information Security Testing and Analysis, emphasize the importance of clear communication and risk assessment during penetration testing. This approach ensures that the client is fully informed of the risks, allowing them to make an informed decision about how to proceed, which might include authorizing a controlled test or accepting the risk for the duration of the assessment. It demonstrates ethical conduct by not proceeding with potentially damaging actions without explicit consent and upholds the principle of minimizing harm. Incorrect approach is analysis. Proceeding with a full exploitation attempt without client notification, despite the risk to production systems, is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This violates the principle of least privilege and could lead to unauthorized system modification or denial of service, which are illegal and unethical actions for a penetration tester. It directly contravenes the client's explicit instructions and could result in legal repercussions and reputational damage for the tester and their organization. Ignoring the vulnerability because it might impact production systems and continuing with the planned assessment without further investigation or reporting is also professionally unacceptable. Failure to adequately analyze and report critical findings constitutes negligence and a breach of professional duty. It leaves the client exposed to a known, high-impact risk, undermining the very purpose of the penetration test. This could be seen as a failure to adhere to the spirit of security assessment guidelines that mandate comprehensive reporting of discovered vulnerabilities. Attempting to exploit the vulnerability in a highly contained, simulated environment that is not part of the agreed-upon scope, without client consent, is also problematic. While the intent might be to gather more information, it deviates from the agreed-upon scope of work and introduces an element of unauthorized activity. This can lead to misunderstandings about the test's findings and potentially create new, unassessed risks if the simulation is not perfectly representative of the production environment. It also bypasses the client's decision-making authority regarding how their systems are tested. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a risk-based decision-making framework. This involves 1. Identifying the critical vulnerability and its potential impact. 2. Assessing the likelihood of impact based on the nature of the vulnerability and the client's environment. 3. Consulting the agreed-upon scope of work and client directives. 4. Prioritizing immediate, clear, and concise communication with the client, presenting the findings and potential risks. 5. Seeking explicit authorization for any actions that carry a risk of disruption, even if the intent is to demonstrate the vulnerability. 6. Documenting all communications and decisions thoroughly. This structured approach ensures that actions are justifiable, ethical, and aligned with client objectives and regulatory compliance. Question 20. Stakeholder feedback indicates that while the penetration test successfully identified numerous technical vulnerabilities, there is a perceived disconnect between the severity of some findings and their prioritization for remediation. The client is questioning why certain vulnerabilities, despite having high technical scores, are not being addressed with the same urgency as others with lower technical scores. As a penetration tester, how should you best address this feedback to ensure effective risk management and client satisfaction? Option A. Provide the client with a detailed technical explanation of each vulnerability, exploitability, and the CVSS scoring for every finding, emphasizing that technical severity is the sole determinant of risk. Option B. Reevaluate all identified vulnerabilities, categorizing them based on their potential business impact and likelihood of exploitation, and present a revised prioritization matrix that clearly links technical findings to specific business risks and potential consequences. Option C. Focus remediation efforts exclusively on the vulnerabilities that were explicitly listed in the original penetration testing scope document, regardless of any newly discovered related risks. Option D. Report all findings with equal weight and detail in the final report, allowing the client to independently determine the business impact and prioritize remediation efforts themselves. Correct answer is B. Reevaluate all identified vulnerabilities, categorizing them based on their potential business impact and likelihood of exploitation, and present a revised prioritization matrix that clearly links technical findings to specific business risks and potential consequences. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in penetration testing where the scope of work, as defined by the client's initial request, may not fully encompass the evolving threat landscape or the client's current risk posture. Stakeholders, often with varying levels of technical understanding and business priorities, may have differing perspectives on what constitutes a critical vulnerability or an acceptable risk. The penetration tester must navigate these differing viewpoints, ensuring that the testing methodology and reporting align with both the agreed-upon scope and the overarching goal of improving the client's security. The professional challenge lies in balancing the contractual obligations with the ethical responsibility to provide comprehensive and actionable security insights, without overstepping the defined boundaries or introducing scope creep without proper authorization. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a structured risk management process that prioritizes identified vulnerabilities based on their potential impact and likelihood, aligning with the CompTIA PenTest plus framework's emphasis on risk assessment and reporting. This approach is best professional practice because it directly addresses the core objective of penetration testing, to identify and quantify security risks. By categorizing vulnerabilities, e.g., critical, high, medium, low, and providing context for their potential business impact, the penetration tester enables the client to make informed decisions about remediation efforts. This aligns with the ethical obligation to provide clear, accurate, and actionable information. Furthermore, it adheres to the principles of risk management, which are fundamental to cybersecurity and are implicitly covered by the CompTIA PenTest Plus objectives, focusing on understanding and communicating risk to stakeholders. Incorrect approaches analysis. Focusing solely on the highest technical severity without considering business context is professionally unacceptable because it can lead to misallocation of resources. A technically severe vulnerability might have a low business impact if compensating controls are in place, or if the affected asset is not critical to operations. This approach fails to meet the ethical obligation of providing relevant and actionable risk information. Prioritizing only vulnerabilities that directly impact the systems explicitly mentioned in the initial scope, while ignoring related or interconnected systems, is also professionally flawed. The CompTIA PenTest Plus emphasizes understanding the broader attack surface and potential lateral movement. Ignoring interconnected systems can lead to a false sense of security, as an attacker might exploit a less obvious path to achieve their objectives. This approach risks failing to identify significant, albeit indirect, risks, reporting every minor finding with equal emphasis, regardless of its potential impact, dilutes the effectiveness of the report. This approach can overwhelm stakeholders with information, making it difficult to prioritize remediation efforts. It fails to demonstrate professional judgment in risk assessment and communication, which is a key competency tested by CompTIA PenTest Plus. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach that integrates technical findings with business context. This involves understanding the client's critical assets and business processes. When discrepancies arise between initial scope and observed risks, open communication with the client is paramount. A professional decision-making process would involve 1. Thoroughly assessing the technical severity of each finding. 2. Evaluating the potential business impact of each finding, considering factors like data confidentiality, integrity, availability, and regulatory compliance. 3. Categorizing findings based on a defined risk matrix, e.g., critical, high, medium, low. 4. Clearly communicating these risks to stakeholders, providing actionable recommendations for remediation. 5. If significant findings fall outside the initial scope, but pose a clear and present danger, initiating a discussion with the client about potential scope adjustments or a separate engagement. This ensures that testing remains relevant, impactful, and ethically sound.